You probably are well acquainted with your career. And, I'm just very thankful that Elke was able to come and talk with us.
Mm-hmm. And I'm very happy to sort of discuss as we go. So don't wait till the end, to ask questions, or start talking about some of these issues. So I'm going to tell you about a theory that Eric Johnson and I have developed over the last 10 years or so, called query theory. And it's basically a process account of decisions under risk and uncertainty. And I was telling Harry earlier, some of the examples to which it applies will probably remind you of the situations that prospect theory also explains. And this is not meant as a competitor to prospect theory. It's meant as a lower level psychological process version that makes the same functional predictions that prospect theory does, but tells you why these functional relationships come about. And we can really sort of come back to that towards the end of my talk. But here's sort of the basic take on preferences in psychology. I mean, anywhere we make the assumption that our preferences determine our decisions. Well, that's in economic decisions, in social decisions, in political decisions. How psychology differs from economics is, or political science, the more normative disciplines. We don't necessarily assume in psychology that our preferences are a primitive, that they are a fixed entity that somehow gets sort of stored in the brain and just needs to be recalled in sort of finding the gold standard for eliciting that preference. But the notion is that we have actually many preferences. There are many components that go into a preference. Our preferences are constructed, not always. I mean, sometimes we do have pre-stored preferences. We might know that we like vanilla ice cream better than chocolate because we've done it many times and sort of it is recorded. But in other situations, if somebody says, "Do you want to be an organ donor or not?" You just have to you think about it, and then you sort of come up with a decision. And you communicate that, in part because different situational contexts. Like, for example, sort of being the default option being that you are a donor unless you decide otherwise, like the way it's in Austria, or the fact that you're not a donor unless you sign up for it, the way it's in the United States. That some of these situational factors make a difference because they differentially focus your attention on different subsets of the information. And again, this is sort of where psychology makes the assumption of at best bounded rationality, as opposed to sort of the complete rationality, where of course it wouldn't make a difference what situation you're in because you're always using all dimensions, sort of to the appropriate degrees consistently all the time. So that's sort of the background against which query theory was developed. And it also was developed as a way of basically unifying with a sort of a common approach and a common framework and a common theory, a whole bunch of phenomena that sort of have been out there. So basically sort of describing how Homo sapiens, this is the decisions under risk and uncertainty and time delay made by real people, humans, as opposed to Homo economicus or econs, how they differ. And sometimes behavioral decision theory that sort of does that has been accused of just basically being a taxonomy of stupid human tricks and not being very, very systematic. And so we've basically been trying to sort of address that with query theory and remedy that to some extent. And so here's the basic framework. So the notion is that when somebody says, do you want option A or option B? Do you want the lottery or the sure thing? Do you want the $50 right away or the $75 in 3 months' time? People generate arguments for why they want option A or why they want option B. Okay? And the more arguments they generate for A, the scale sort of tips in his favor. So far, it sounds actually pretty reasonable and pretty normative. But because of bounded rationality, these queries, what's good about option A, what's good about option B, are assumed to be issued sequentially. And that's a little bit like these reversible figures that you have seen. I mean, you can actually sort of see the two children looking at each other if the black is a foreground, or you can see the candlestick if the white is the foreground. You can switch back and forth between those two images, but you can't really see them both at the same time. That's this notion that we are really sort of restricted. We have restricted attention and we're restricted processes, and hence so these two queries, what's good about A, what's good about B, are issued sequentially, and then of course the recall sort of flows back and gets accumulated somewhere in the brain. But here's the other crucial assumption function, that wouldn't matter if basically the order in which you issue the queries doesn't matter. Yeah, but it turns out, all other things being equal, whatever option we consider first has a higher probability of sort of recalling arguments. Yeah? And the reason is that as you think about what's good about A, you temporarily inhibit sort of response competitors, all arguments for all other options. Yeah? Now then, as you turn to them, now you sort of you figured out what's good about A, you turn to what's good about B, because those arguments were just a split second before were temporarily inhibited, they have a harder time coming to the surface. Yeah? And so we have a lot of evidence for that, sort of, lots of different contexts. That seems to be sort of the million-dollar question: what options gets considered first? Now, you might obviously switch back and forth. You might go from A to B, back to A, back to B, maybe to C. But the crucial thing is which option you consider first, because that's the one that has never been inhibited. Its arguments are never inhibited. Okay, so this is sort of the basic setup, and as I said, the goal was to unify this long and disparate list of decision phenomena, but then also sort of, and this gets sort of to the point where query theory is different from prospect theory, rather than sort of just replacing one functional model, expected utility theory, with another one, albeit sort of somewhat more complex, but still a functional mapping, input-output kind of mapping of prospect theory. We know a lot, and we've studied a lot in psychology about memory, about attention, and why not sort of bring these psychological processes and what we know about them to bear on decisions, because the same brain that categorizes, the same brain that sort of scans the environment, perception and attention, also makes decisions. Yeah? And so whatever regularities we have in one domain presumably also matter for decision making. And so let's translate these psychological insights into decision aids, because the other thing is, if you have a psychological process model, and process model means that sort of basically sort of that it's not just an as-if model, but you actually sort of assume that these processes are at work. Well, then you should be able to sort of intervene, right? If it's a causal model, then by tweaking the components, you should be able to change the answers. And of course, in many situations, we're trying to do that. Oftentimes, people make decisions that they regret after the fact. You're on a diet, but you eat that piece of pie afterwards. But sort of tomorrow morning, sort of when you step on the scale, you wished you hadn't done that. We don't save enough for our retirement. Chances are we're going to regret that when we turn 65 or 70. And so there are lots of situations where people make decisions that sort of that probably have to do with some sort of version of myopia, short-sightedness. And so the question is, are there ways in which we can sort of restructure the choice environments in a way that people sort of don't fall prey to maybe these kinds of inconsistencies and quote-unquote errors. So let's start with a phenomenon. And I sort of alluded to discounting in intertemporal choice. And there are many situations where sort of we do have some immediate option right now, that piece of pie, or there's some future rewards, sort of basically sort of staying healthier and staying slimmer down the road, or also the pension example, sort of having that money available for consumption now. We can buy that extra car, that extra boat, that larger house, or putting it away for the future. It's sort of beyond individual, it's a societal level. These days we struggle a lot with sustainable development in general, sustainable energy use, and again, sort of their immediate options that might sort of be cheaper in the short run, but have sort of long-term consequences, including sort of climate change and other issues like that. So intertemporal choice or discounting clearly is an important phenomenon to understand. Let's sort of see if we can test the psychological process assumptions that query theory makes in this context. Yeah? And so this is a typical setup in the lab. Sort of basically boiling it down to its most basic components. There's some amount, some reward that you can get today immediately, the sooner smaller option, or something that you can get later, but it's larger. So $45.70, but you have to wait 4 weeks for that to happen. And turns out most of the time for these kinds of choices, people go with the immediate rewards, the sooner smaller reward. The discount rate, is basically the interest rate that we're foregoing, is pretty high for these kind of situations. It's much higher than sort of economic discount rate, economic interest rates. So here are some stylized facts. So first of all, the first one I already alluded to, people are very impatient. We discount too much, again, too much compared to these economic rates, what banks are willing to pay us for. But here's another phenomenon that George Lorenzen actually documented for the first time in 1988. We actually discount less when we are accelerating consumption than when we're delaying it. And so what do I mean by that? Well, when we delaying consumption is a typical thing. So you're ordering something, you expect it to be shipped right away, but if you're willing to wait, you pay less for shipping. Okay, and so the default option is that it's going to come right away, or you get it right away, but you can sort of delay and get more if you're willing to wait. Well, acceleration is the opposite. Basically, sort of, you were expecting to get that iPad in 3 weeks' time, but now Apple calls you up and says, well, we have this product available immediately. Sort of, you can have it today if you want, but you have to pay a little extra for that. And so it turns out that people are willing to pay less to speed up consumption than they're asking to be compensated for delaying consumption.
So on the previous slide, this is a result of this has been tested in experiments, I assume, this type of question.
Right.
So how is it presented?
So the acceleration versus delay? Okay, so this is...
How is it presented to the people, the subjects? I guess, is it just as you said, right?
Yeah, so for example, so I'll show you like a real study in a second. And so basically, but it's typical pairwise decisions with sometimes the sooner smaller is immediately, sometimes it's not. It could be like this.
Be like Columbia students or something.
Well, we do our studies actually on the web, so we have like a more representative sample that varies in income and age and so on. But I mean, it depends on which study. They tend to be incentive compatible in the sense that sort of typically probabilistically one of those decisions that you make is actually going to be selected at the end, if you make a series of them, and randomly, and that's the one you're going to get paid for. So if you picked this one right away, you're going to get that money today. We take away the risk that comes out of the delay by oftentimes sending them a gift certificate that on the same day, but they only can be redeemed in 4 weeks' time. Okay, so there's no question. There's no question about how you're going to get it or not. You still have that thing, but you can't use it until 4 weeks' time.
Okay, so that was.
So the counterparty risk is taken out.
There's no. Okay, so there's no additional cost in actually coming back and picking this thing up.
No, it's going to be sent to you by email. By tonight, either way, and okay. And so let's.
You actually send them the money?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's and sometimes sort of if demands are like this, oftentimes like only 1 out of 4 people gets paid but you don't know that ex ante. So it depends on the amounts and the study, but it varies. But it turns out it makes no difference. If you pay everyone or if you pay people probabilistically, the choice patterns are exactly the same. And so let me sort of show you what this acceleration versus delay actually looks like. Because this basically now gets to the notion about making one option sort of the default option. So the one that you expect to get. So in the delay condition, you're expecting, and this is exactly what subjects say. You're assigned to get this Amazon gift certificate for $58.30 today, but if you want to wait a little longer, you can get more. Okay, and then the question is, which one do you take? The one on the left, the one on the right? We also sort of typically counterbalance the order in which the options are shown, to make sure reading order doesn't play a role. So that's the delay condition. So the notion is the immediate consumption is a focal option, but you can switch away from it. Okay, you can switch to the sooner small to the larger later, or in the acceleration condition, people are sent, you're assigned to get this large amount of money in 2 weeks' time. But if you want to get it right away today, okay, you can choose this one, which is less. And again, which one do you prefer? Okay. So just verbally, I mean, we already said this, sort of basically telling them $50 or get more, or $70 in 3 months' time, or get less today. So basically just reformulating this. This is sort of typically what we do our experiments on, in part because we actually had a hard time getting enough sort of subjects at Columbia when we started doing experiments there 17, 18 years ago. But it turns out the web is actually a great invention because sort of you get a much more representative set of people. You can do it internationally if you want to. But as you can see, sort of gender is pretty balanced. We have a range of ages. We have a range of incomes, and in this case, 150 participants was randomly selected.
Did a lot of Russian participants?
No, you have to screen for people. Oftentimes you get like sort of clouds of Chinese, sort of like this one URL that sort of gets replicated. But we screen for that. And we have very good ways of making sure that these are real respondents. And we also have, well, there are different ways of cleaning up the data. But yeah, you have to. That's the drawback of not having people in the lab. So now the question is, how do we find out what people, which option people are considering first? Because sort of, remember, query theory basically says, well, you sort of think first what's good about the sooner, smaller option, or what's good about the larger, later option. How do we know what kind of queries people automatically issue to their memory base? That has to do with sort of options like that and evaluating what's good about them or what's bad about them. Well, the assumption, of course, is not that people do this consciously. It's not that you sit down and say, okay, what's good about this one? Whoa, what's good about this one? Whoa. And then sort of you consciously weigh these things. The notion is you send this command to your episodic and semantic memory base, and feedback comes back. That's not necessarily verbal. I mean, some of it has to be just with emotional responses, valences, all sorts of things come flooding back and get accumulated in one way or the other. But what we do with people in situations like this, we basically give people the choice that you just saw, acceleration versus delay, and then we say, okay, before you make this decision, why don't you type out loud, this is done on the web, type out loud what goes through your mind as you make this decision. We pre-train them to do this one thought at a time and hit carriage returns, and then they make their decisions. Okay? And then when they're done, after that choice, we show them the fragments that they generated, what goes through your mind, and we ask them to code them. Either they themselves code them, or we have sort of regular coders, naive coders, basically telling us that this segment, this one fragment, favor option A, favor option B, favor both or neither. And so then basically you can sort of see these thoughts that people generated, which we assume are sort of like a random subset of the flow of information that sort of gets accumulated. Basically sort of are either coming randomly interspersed, the arguments for A and for B are randomly interspersed, or they actually come clustered, and we have like just a clustering index, and then the assumption is the cluster that comes first, if there is clustering, should generate more arguments. That sort of would be evidence for query theory. And then most importantly, sort of that the order and the frequency of arguments should actually mediate choice. Then you can sort of basically just do a mediation analysis, see do these two arguments actually generate choice, predict choice. So what do we get? Well, first of all, can you show me the results for the experiment I just described to you, either making the immediate consumption option the default and asking people to delay consumption, or making the larger later option the default and asking people whether they want to accelerate consumption. Does it make a difference in terms of their choices? What I'm plotting here is the discount factor. In other words, the amount of money that a dollar in a year's time is worth to you today. Okay, therefore, more discounting means smaller bars. In the delay condition, a dollar in a year's time is worth to you 34 cents today. In the acceleration condition, that is sort of the discount is much reduced. A dollar is worth to you 57 cents today. So yes, people are more impatient in the delay condition. So we basically replicate Lowenstein 1988. Okay, now the question is, does query theory processes predict that? And first of all, you can just sort of look at people's arguments, categorize them according to whether they favor delay or the acceleration condition, the proportion of impatient aspects, proportion of impatient meaning those that favor immediate consumption, is higher in the delay than the acceleration condition. And presumably this should be generated by differences in clustering. And in both conditions, you see a significant clustering if they're not randomly interspersed arguments for one or for the other. And arguments for the immediate consumption come first in the delay condition, and they come second in the acceleration condition. Okay? Then you can sort of basically just see, you can combine, we have now two pieces of evidence for the prominence of impatient aspects, the clustering number and the proportion. You combine those into a single factor, and they predict everybody's responses, very well. That's very strongly predictive. On top of that, they predict the differences in tasks and conditions. Mm-hmm. So we do this in many of our studies. We basically sort of do the first study to see if there's evidence, sort of for query theory. And the second one then says, okay, if this is a causal model, we should be able to put it to work. Okay, and then we basically start to intervene. And so if it is indeed the case that generating arguments for immediate consumption early on, first in the delay condition, okay, generates more arguments for that condition, and doing the opposite for the acceleration condition, because acceleration is a default, is a focal option. People consider it first, and the other one second. If we should be able to let not just people do this naturally, but we should be able to tell people, first think about, in the delay condition, what's good about immediate consumption, and then tell us what's good about waiting and getting more. Okay? Or we can do it, they're still in the same condition, they're still in the delay condition, but now we're telling them explicitly to first tell us what's good about waiting and getting more, and then tell us what's good about the immediate consumption option. And the same in the acceleration condition. If it is the order, now it's no longer, there's nothing implicit about generation, it's explicit. It should sort of generate the same pattern of responses under the natural order, and it should make the difference in conditions go away, or ideally actually flip in the unnatural order. So this is what we get. Exactly the same stimuli as you saw before, but now instead of just telling people to type out loud what goes through your mind, we first tell them either in the natural or the unnatural order. First tell us what's good about the sooner smaller option, then about the larger later option, and orthogonally to the condition that they're in. When under the natural condition, we have exactly the same response pattern, but more extreme. Okay, people are much more impatient in the delay condition than the acceleration condition, and it should be more extreme because now the clustering is actually perfect. We're telling them first generate all arguments for one and then for the other. And as you can see, when under the unnatural condition, the difference becomes non-significant. And I think the reason for that is that even though we're telling them explicitly to do it in the unnatural order, the natural order pattern is just so strong. We tend to look first at default options that sort of the natural, the explicit and the implicit way of doing things actually cancel each other out. Okay? And so basically, and as a result of that, the difference.
Is it necessary to have to start with one of these conditions, delay or acceleration? You can't present the options symmetrically.
You can, but I mean, sort of the point about query theory is to say that the order in which we consider option matters. Okay? And so then, and so right now we're sort of establishing that it does matter. Then the million-dollar question after that is, what determines the order in which people consider options? And sort of one answer to that question, and maybe the most important answer to that question in terms of interventions, is that if something is a default option, we think about that first. Now, if there is no default, and we certainly have done experiments on that, then other factors play a role. Like, for example, is it on the left or on the right? And so if you're an American respondent, you tend to look because of reading order, you look at the left one first, and then on the right one. If you're an Israeli, you probably do the opposite. And so reading order makes a difference. You find that kind of a pattern also in voting decisions. Most, I think, something like 16 states randomly rotate candidates on the ballot in terms of, so the order in which they appear. In this case, it's top to bottom. And that makes significant differences in some cases, like up to 7% differences in voting patterns in states where you can actually check on the effect of list on the order. But that would be like basically sort of other factors, not whether something's a default or not, but reading order or how flashy something is. I'll show you some other results sort of in a second. But it's a good question. You don't need that, changing the default option, but it helps to sort of say, well, here's what we would expect it to be, and which we demonstrate by looking at what the natural order is.
When you tell the participant which to consider first, I mean, do they get that instruction before they see the two options, or after they see the two options?
I think after they see the two options.
Okay.
Yeah, so they see the two options, and then we tell them, sort of, in the first experiment, just tell us what goes through your mind out loud, or in the second one, generate arguments for this one or this one in this order.
I was wondering sort of how quickly things might be generated while you're giving the instruction.
And I think it's because of that the unnatural order doesn't flip, because so they first see it, process it the way they would naturally, and then they're being told to explicitly do it the opposite direction. So, general conclusions is that the arguments for the choice default get considered first. And that probably is sort of one of the contributors to this huge amount of status quo bias that we see. I mean, it makes a lot of sense to think, what does default mean? Default in many situations means we're going to continue doing what we've been doing for a while. So you're going to continue to drive on the right because we've been driving on the right-hand side for a while. Continue to buy this breakfast cereal because we've been buying it for a while. And if it's a behavioral default, it makes sense to think first what's good about what I've been doing for a while. You probably had some good reason to do it in the first place. You might even done a cost-benefit analysis under some conditions to determine what was good about that. It hasn't killed you yet, so it can't be all that dangerous. And so it seems very reasonable to think first about the status quo. But of course, that also then means that basically, and you can sort of see that the effect is quite large. In the case of discounting, almost like a factor of 2 to 1. That sounds a lot like prospect theory and loss aversion, and so a factor of 2 to 1. So what that really means is that people are going to have a hard time changing from something where they're losing something to by giving up the default to something that's new. The new has to be almost twice as good than the old before people are switching. And so it's not the only reason for status quo bias, but it's probably one of the contributors for status quo bias. And then also more importantly, sort of having this process model provides you with an entry point for interventions and for decision aids. And so if most of the time future options are not what we naturally focus on, because we were evolutionary bred to care about today. If you don't live to tomorrow morning as a little songbird, who cares? How much food you've put away for future seasons. And so if our natural focus is on the here and now, then we can actually help people overcome this myopia by basically sort of presenting them with options that favor future consumption or future considerations first. These days, that's the other thing about decisions these days, in electronic environments, we have a lot of latitude about in which sequence people see information, and so we can again sort of easily sort of contribute either by reading order, by presentation order, or by making options a default. So we can change people's preferences in the intertemporal context and in other contexts, like the organ donation is another example, where there's a default. Either you are a organ donor unless you decide otherwise, or you're not an organ donor unless you decide otherwise. And as you know, going back 10, 15 years, there's a lot of evidence that these default conditions make huge differences, not just in willingness to be a donor, but in actual transplantation rates, in countries that have different defaults around the world. Okay, so a few years ago, actually had the privilege of contributing to a workshop with His Holiness the Dalai Lama on sort of what to do about environmental degradation. So basically he has been studying meditation for a long time using the neurosciences, and I think sort of figured, been there, done that, and was sort of trying to move on and get his monks out of the monasteries and into the valleys and do something about environmental degradation. And so for 2 or 3 days, they were physical scientists. They were talking about planetary boundaries. And at the end of those 2 days, he said, well, this is great. Now we know what the problem is. Now we can just basically solve it. And everybody says, well, it's not quite so simple, Your Holiness. But he said, no, you just have to sort of tell people better. So you have to say it louder, say it more convincingly. You're falling down on the job. And so then a day later, it sort of came my turn to talk about decision making, and I sort of said, well, let's look at sort of let's pit redesigning people's choice environments against this notion of education and awareness, just telling people sort of more what's at stake and how to change it. And it turns out that when you go to a conference in the United States, as you know, oftentimes you pre-register what kind of food you want to get for lunch, and typically there's like a beef option, a chicken option, or a fish option, and there's also a vegetarian option. And across all conventions in the United States, only about 5% of people sort of pick the vegetarian option. And it's typically pretty bad, as you know. You just get the steamed vegetables, that come with the meat dishes or the fish dish. Now, it turns out that there is a conference called BEC, Behavior environment and climate change that meets every year, takes turn between Sacramento and Washington, and something like 1,000 people come to this conference, and everybody there knows extremely well what the impact of especially red meat eating is, sort of on in the environment, first of all on the animals, but also on the environment in terms of contribution to climate change, methane, and so on. And that sort of having more meatless dietary habits can greatly contribute to the public good. And people that are doing research in this domain tend to sort of actually want to contribute to the public good. So the question is, how much does people's willingness to sign up for the vegetarian option go up for the Beck conference relative to the national average? And so the national average is 5%. And so let's see, let's take some bids here. How much at Beck? 6%? 10? Okay. Not bad, 17 actually. Okay, so it says, okay, Dalai Lama says, look, it's from 5 to 17%, right? And so it works. It's more than 3 times. So obviously awareness is the issue, and therefore motivation plays a role. And so we've gone from 5 to 17%. Well, turns out in 2009, I think the organizer of the conference sort of was first learning about these default effects, and she said, why don't we just sort of pre-check the vegetarian option on the registration form? And now, in terms of effort of making a decision, it just takes just as much effort to change it away from the vegetarian pre-check to the beef that you want, as opposed to checking the beef in the first place. I mean, there's no difference in what you actually, as a registrant, have to do. There's no difference in the level of awareness and conscious attention to this issue. The question is, how much did this pre-checking, the making the vegetarian option the default, contribute to people choosing it? So, what do you think?
90%.
Very good. 80. I mean, just the amount of space I left on that graph is like a giveaway, but it made a huge difference. Okay, and so in some sense, the Dalai Lama was right, but I was right as well. I mean, there's something about sort of just changing the structure of the decision that makes it just for some reason more compelling. And query theory is one explanation for that. Sort of not just because something is pre-checked now, visually your eye gets drawn to this, and so you think about it first. Also because it was pre-checked, probably the assumption is that the people who sort of put this, so who send you this registration form, probably implicitly endorse it, which is another reason to look at this one first. And so there's all sorts of reasons for why your attention might actually be drawn to the pre-checked option. But the bottom line is, by virtue of pre-checking it, you also are favoring it in terms of generation of arguments for it. And which is one of the contributors to the default effect. Okay, so let me sort of say a little bit more about what query theory actually can explain. It sounds, the way I described it, it sounded like a pretty dry sort of cognitive theory, right? It has to do with information generation, biased information, so it's biased information generation as a function of what captures your attention, whether it's a default or whether it's reading order and so on. But turns out that it also sort of has other, not more than just cognitive components. And so a number of 2 or 3 years ago, I gave a talk at a conference with for psychology textbook writers, and so I was trying to get query theory into as many chapters as possible. So I was arguing that it shouldn't just be in the chapter on cognitive psychology, because it also plays a role in emotional regulation and in motivation. So this came out of this realization came out of a talk I gave at the Kennedy School like a year or so earlier. Jen Lerner was in the audience, and she's been studying basically consumer decisions, with people who are sad. She's very interested in what people do when they're sad as opposed to when they're disgusted or when they're happy. She found in this consumer context that at least in Western countries, when people get sad, they go shopping. They basically fill up the emptiness with stuff. And so they're much more likely to sort of buy all sorts of things in a sad state as opposed to a neutral or a happy state. And so when she saw my results about delayed consumption and sort of taking money immediately or money in the future or things in the future, she was saying, well, if I'm sad, I basically have to get stuff, and I have to get stuff now. And so therefore I should be more impatient. The effect of focusing my attention sort of on the here and now should be much stronger when I'm sad than in these other states. And so we tested that. And by basically showing people movie clips that either made them sad or neutral. Neutral was just showing them like a Scientific American clip. Sad was something out of The Champ, this little boy facing death of this. older person that he likes, or disgust. And for some reason, the green didn't come through, but you can sort of see the mean up there. Disgust came like a clip out of Train Spotting. And as you can see, again, we're plotting here the discount factor. Smaller bars means people are more impatient. You can see that people are much more impatient in the sad condition. In other words, they want to get that money right away, presumably to use it to buy stuff. Oops, here we go. In terms of thought listings, the impatient thoughts are significantly more frequent in that condition. And also, in terms of sort of the focus of attention, the thought clustering is strongly in favor of the immediate consumption option for the sad conditions and not for the other two. And in combination, those two factors, again, strongly predict the differences in preferences as a function of the mood states these people are in. Also, in addition to sort of putting it into the motivational chapter, we have also applied this paradigm with abnormal populations, with patient populations. And so this intertemporal choice task has been used a lot with eating disorder patients. It turns out when you have anorexia, there are two types of anorexics. There are anorexics that, let me just show you the next slide, anorexics that eat but then binge and purge, or some anorexics who basically restrict their input. They don't eat. Now, anorexics that don't eat, it sounds like they have like a lot of self-control. Yeah. So what we most of us miss in the context of intertemporal choice, the 1 versus 2 marshmallows, 1 marshmallow an hour versus 2 marshmallows in 20 minutes. We don't have enough self-control to wait for the second marshmallow for a little bit of time or a little bit more money in 2 weeks' time. Anorexics might actually have too much of that. And so we were predicting that anorexics in general might be more patient in intertemporal context. What we were curious about was whether or not they would show the same pattern of responses, like a main effect of being more patient, but still showing different responses to when immediate consumption was the default as opposed to when delayed consumption was the default. Initially we thought we would only get differences between, first of all, these two types of anorexics in healthy controls for food stimuli. But we thought, well, what the heck, let's start with our financial stimuli that we have used for all these other patients just for comparisons. And if there's nothing there, then we move to foods. Turns out you don't have to move to foods. What you see, first of all, is that here's the delay condition. For the delay condition, the restricting anorexics are significantly more patient than the other two, than the binge purge anorexics or the normal controls. That's also true for the acceleration conditions. There's a main effect, but you see the pattern that people are more patient in this condition than in the other condition holds for all three groups. And so that's like they have more self-control, but the basic idea about focusing attention on one or the other, that making a difference in the arguments people generate and the arguments mediating in choice, that holds even for these patient populations. Okay, so as I already said, this sort of query order then basically becomes the $1 million question, because that sort of seems to be able to shape choices quite significantly. And default options being one important answer to what gets considered first. But then the question that we already sort of anticipated a little bit, what are some of the other things that sort of would basically give rise to these preferences for processing one option than the others? We talked about reading order, left to right, top to bottom, and this is a result on about political candidates that John Krosnick and others have demonstrated a lot of times. But the other thing also might have to do with sort of basically initial emotional reactions to a stimulus. So the kind of label that you put on an attribute might make a difference. So let me sort of give you an example of that. Something that puzzled me a while ago was the fact that most Americans hate taxes, and especially sort of carbon taxes. And at the same time, the uptake of these carbon offsets, these indulgences that you can buy to travel across the country without feeling guilty about it, has been doubling ever since they were introduced. And so one question was, are those the same people who hate the taxes and buy the offsets, or are those different people? If they are the same people, is there something about the word offset or tax that makes a difference? The notion is that at least, especially for Republicans, people with a certain political ideology, the word tax is like this trigger negative connotation, and you're basically going to switch away from something that has the word tax in it and look at the other option.
So I think this offset thing you just explained, I'm not familiar with. Could you say?
Yeah, and so basically, sort of, when Lufthansa for a while actually was doing this automatically, but sort of when you fly a certain distance, there are independent companies that basically will sell you an offset that for a certain amount of money. In this case, the offset to travel round trip from California to New York City would be worth $7.70. That money is used to basically maybe reduce methane from some garbage dump, and so. What the providers of these offsets do, they provide you with 2 pages of text about, first of all, why it's cost you $70.70, because it has to do with how much carbon you're emitting by traveling across the country.
So where does the money go?
It goes to things like these green funds that the IPCC has.
So it's a form of
it's a form of mitigation.
But it's a form of
greenhouse gas mitigation.
Fundraising for
for this green development funds. And it's quite a large market. It's billions of dollars that get sent to these funds every year, completely voluntary. And the advantage seems to be that people feel less guilty about traveling.
And some travel agents or airlines put this on their website.
On their website.
You can check it.
That's right. And as I was saying, Lufthansa for a while actually had this automatically added to it unless you opted out. That didn't last very long. I think there must have been some consumer reaction against it when it was happening like 10 years or so ago. But now most airlines actually have that as an option. You can typically they take you to a different provider to do that. But I mean it's a huge business.
Does it make a difference whether you fly from Los Angeles to New York round trip or from New York to Los Angeles?
Good question. I don't know. We didn't test that. Probably not. Yeah. But basically, we had like a series of choices like this. But this is an example. So ticket A is this round trip that includes this carbon. Basically, it's a carbon user fee, right? And or the trip ticket by itself. And then the carbon user fee was either being described as a carbon tax, the word tax, or a carbon offset. And then everybody saw this same exact 2 pages of text about why it was the amount that it was, how it was going to be used. Lot of information completely identical. The only difference was really the word tax versus offset. Now, we called this the dirty word or dirty world. So the study setup was exactly as I described to you before. Basically, people are given this choice. You want this ticket or this ticket, either carbon tax or carbon offset, varied with that. Then we ask people, why don't you type out loud what goes through your mind as you make this decision. They make their decision. Then we ask them a bunch of demographics, including their self-reported political affiliation. And when the carbon user fee is called a carbon offset, it makes no difference how they describe themselves. Something like 62% of people buy the inclusive ticket. So when we call that a carbon tax, it doesn't matter to the Democrats. They're just as likely to buy the inclusive ticket that has the user fee. But for Republicans, goes down to something like 27%. It's like a huge difference in uptake. And the independents are halfway in between. And so let me just show you what these thought listings look like. So in general, people on average generate 3 thoughts with some standard deviation. There's no difference between what their political beliefs were or which frame they were in, the offset or the tax frame, how many of these arguments they generate. Here's just an example of one. Good for the environment, carbon offset, not much more than regular ticket. What does the extra money do to offset the carbon? And again, you can code those. Are they favoring one or the other? And look for clustering and frequency. Here's another one. Why would I ever pay extra for this? Or you don't care about a carbon tax. It's the same thing. Get rid of the tax. Government needs to stop taxing us randomly. I'll be old and dead by the time this world has an energy crisis. By this I mean a huge one where we're all effed. This is a ridiculous thought to have. And so, as I said, you code these and see what the effect is. This is now order of thoughts. As you can see, for the Democrats, basically arguments for the inclusive tickets come first, significantly clustered. For the Republicans, it's significantly before it's sort of neutral, but afterwards, strongly away from that. The independents in the middle. That translates also into frequency of thought, the same kind of thought pattern. Again, if you put those two together, you can, in a mediation analysis, have complete mediation of the differences in choice patterns. Now, I don't have the data on that here, but for this we also have a second study where we basically now sort of intervene. Right? So we're telling people, okay, first generate arguments for the inclusive ticket, then for the other ticket, as a function of being either in the offset or in the tax condition. I mean, the takeaway from psychology textbooks is that people will do whatever they're told, right, including shocking their confederate, if the person in the white lab coat tells them what to do. Well, in this case, the Republicans who are giving the carbon tax frame and were being told to first generate arguments for the carbon tax, something like 40% of them actually violated instructions. They were not giving us arguments for that, but arguments against that. And so they basically did not follow instructions. Those that did follow instructions actually also basically showed that this reduction in preference went way down, or sort of became not significant. So here again, we find that when people do follow instructions for the unnatural order of generating arguments, sort of it changes things. But here, the tendency to switch away from this dirty word tax and anything but that was very, very strong, and much stronger than in some of the other studies.
So this was an experiment too. So
Right.
None of these subjects are actually spending money on the ticket.
No, this was a hypothetical. That's right.
Right. Because, well, I would find it hard to believe that 65% of people at all would do this. I assume that they don't. But do you know what?
It's much lower than that, yeah. But it's partly lower than because most people are not even aware of the fact. Sort of most of the time you just buy a ticket and sort of you don't see that they're down there. You could also buy the offset. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Right. But also, I mean, I guess the additional money you're spending is theoretical too. I mean. Right.
Exactly. That's right. But as I said, I mean, there are billions of dollars each year that get spent on this, which has no material benefit for you. I mean, other than sort of the warm glow of knowing that you sort of did your part, or perhaps the reduction of guilt that you feel, because we are aware of the fact that traveling by airplane is the worst thing you can do. I mean, all the other things that you do in terms of driving the energy efficient car and doing this and doing that and signing up for green electricity. This is the first time you fly even to Minnesota, that's all gone. And so this is a huge impact on your carbon budget.
But what this does show is at least the change in the language has an effect.
Yeah, has an effect, that's right. Well, hypothetical or not, I mean, that's, yeah, exactly.
So I've lost track of what query theory says.
Query theory says that there's a huge advantage to the option that you consider first, because you first generate arguments for it.
An argument, so you think about the arguments and then you make a decision. So it's not like the arguments you thought about most recently are important. It's the arguments you thought about first that are important. Is that right? Is that what the theory is saying? Well,
it's not so much primacy and recency. I mean, that's really more of a memory phenomenon. Yeah, we all know about the serial position effect, and
you mentioned that first. So you did mention this primacy and recency.
Primacy in terms of which option you think about first. Okay, and options that you can think of first in terms of generating arguments for doing that, which could be arguments for it or against the other one, but arguments for one course of action. And the important thing about what you consider first is because you generate more of that.
But it's almost like it's not like you're really deciding after you've thought about all the arguments. You've already decided after you've thought about those first few arguments.
No. I mean,
there's no effect of, you don't forget about those arguments that you considered first.
Yeah, I think you have to distinguish between sort of our clumsy way of externalizing something that happens automatically, which is sort of the people generating these arguments and the thought list that I showed you, and what happens automatically and naturally and completely out of your awareness most of the time. And so when you see these two options, this one ticket over there and this one ticket over there, basically sort of you focus on one first and then on the other one, and you tell your brain or your experience base, tell me what's good about this and tell me what's good about that. Okay, now then sort of and that is issued sequentially. So the one that you generate first, its arguments are never inhibited. because the arguments for the other ones are inhibited because the first one says, okay, just arguments for me first, and I'll get to the other ones later. And so therefore they have a harder time. So everything in the associative network that's not for the first option that you consider is automatically diminished a little bit, and that's why they have a harder time sort of coming in. Now, then the notion is that as these things come back, and some of them might come back faster because they have more intense signals, they get sort of a little scrambled up, but there's still clustering because of the first one gets issued first. Then they go into some sort of random walk model, if you want. That basically says, okay, in favor of A, I go up to A. In favor of B, I go down a step, up. Then at some point I hit a border. If the border is for A, I choose A, I'm done. So there's this random walk process. As evidence comes in, you basically sort of are in this preference space, you wait until you hit one boundary or the other, until you have enough evidence for one or the other.
Okay.
You want to ask a few more questions? I'm obviously not explaining it well.
I think I have a picture better.
Yeah.
For the political candidates, I guess, was that mostly in, I guess, races where the voters don't really know who the candidates are ahead of time, or is there shown any difference?
No, I mean that it even works for like political, like presidential candidates.
I see.
So not surprisingly, Florida is one of those states where it's not randomly rotated, and for the ones where it's not randomly rotated, different people decide. So sometimes it's a governor, sometimes it's some other entity. In Florida, it was the governor who in 2000, obviously he was related to the political candidate who won, Bush. You could possibly argue that sort of the Gore losing was due to sort of non-random rotation on the presidential slate.
Could you?
Yeah, I mean the fact for in Ohio and in California, where they are randomly rotated, the effect was strong enough to basically sort of nullify or have Gore win in Florida.
So when they're randomly rotated in these other states, every person sees a different order?
No, different precincts.
Yeah. Okay.
But there's enough precincts that's still random.
Wouldn't it go kind of counter to this experiment, where even if we are asking them to, once we say it's text, or even asking them to think in an unnatural order, they're still thinking of the same order that is about text. So when you're going to vote, so it's in terms of party, there are again two parties. Wouldn't they be more kind of thinking about this thing, like I'm going to vote for that party?
Right. Obviously, sort of the order in which you see the candidates is not determining who you vote for. I mean, it's a small additional effect, but it in some. You think about it basically as a battle for attention, and some of our attention is driven by our preferences, and so sort of you are a Democrat, so you're looking for Gore on that ballot, but just the fact sort of whether or not so you look for Gore and you see Gore first, or you see Gore second or third makes a difference. And so it's enough to sort of slow you down if you want, to generate some arguments for the other names that you see first, that it reduces the likelihood of being elected by or being voted on by 2%, maybe 3%. But it's not a huge effect, but it can be significant in tight races, as races these days typically are. Okay. And so in terms of general conclusions, our ability to predict preferences, obviously sort of is important. And errors in prediction make a difference. And assuming that sort of people's choices are made rationally, in the sense that sort of some of these contextual factors don't play a role, do lead to errors in prediction. These context effects are there. And to sort of use additional disciplines, like for example insights from psychology, into making these kind of predictions, you can think about as sort of the social science equivalent of crowdsourcing, does seem to pay off. I mean, sort of again getting back to sort of the Dalai Lama example, sort of it shouldn't matter whether or not the vegetarian option is pre-checked, for the attendance of the Beck conference. The information that they have about sort of the virtues and vices of meat eating are exactly the same in the two conditions. But it does. It makes a huge difference. Not always that big, but sort of nevertheless. To the extent that intervention is desirable, I mean, there are many situations where sort of people make decisions that might contradict rational models, and they're perfectly happy with it. But there also are lots of situations where people sort of do feel that they're making errors. They pay for pre-commitment devices. Ulysses tying himself to the mast, because he realizes he can't resist the sirens. There are many situations in real life where that's the case, and there basically the question is, what are effective interventions that sort of don't take away people's choice? I mean, sort of tying yourself to the mast is pretty extreme. Can be seen as paternalistic, but just pre-checking the vegetarian option, for example, doesn't take away anybody's preference for the other options. If you strongly feel about getting your beef, you can have your beef with the same amount of effort that you had checking it sort of on the blank list. But these more libertarian paternalist options sort of have been been increased in frequency, in part because they help us overcome some of these cognitive errors without necessarily taking away sort of the liberty to choose different options that you get by regulatory responses, or by more extreme interventions. So query theory describes this general process of sequential argument generation. Again, to summarize, the first option considered has a great advantage because its arguments for pursuing it are never inhibited. And then the million-dollar question is, which option does get considered first? The examples that I showed you had to do with the option being the default, immediate consumption or delayed consumption being the option that pertains unless you make a decision otherwise. Reading order or other cultural habits. Prepotent options like the immediate option, getting back to the marshmallow test, so the 2-year-old in all of us who says, I want my cookie now, I'm not willing to wait, or just the attractiveness or unattractiveness, the aversiveness of certain kind of labels, that sort of basically says, I'm not going to do anything that has to do with taxes, that's against my belief, against my religion. The question is, how can we use this kind of information? One of them is that it basically can sort of use it for our own sort of self-regulation, or sort of helping ourselves make better decisions, like setting defaults, for example. Status-quo-bias is everywhere. It's not just people, but we all have it. I hate to actually change my software because I find it very annoying, and it's so much easier to do things the way I'm used to. But I also know that in 2 or 3 weeks' time I'm going to be happy because I changed it. First of all, it's safer, and secondly, I might have new features that I didn't have before. But as a way of basically sort of preventing myself from not doing something that I know I'm going to regret not doing down the road, I just, whenever my IT guy tells me I should do something, I'll do it. Or also sort of basically sort of trying to sort of counteract the way we do things naturally. So we have a good friend in California who likes to shop, and she heard me talk about this like 5 or 6 years ago, and I saw her 2 years later at a conference, or a year later at a conference, and she said, you have no idea how much money you've saved me, because now whenever I see something that I want to buy, I first ask myself, why don't I need this new coat? Why don't I need this new sweater? And so again, sort of just sort of telling yourself to do things in the unnatural order might be a way of sort of again temporarily refocusing your attention enough to overcome these choice patterns that you might feel bad about afterwards. And then in general, it's also a way of helping others. Paternalism or maternalism, for that matter, doesn't have to be a dirty word. There's a reason why we have parents. Sort of because 2-year-olds probably don't know what the right nutritional value is for different foods, and so having people or having agencies sort of maybe help us with our decisions by making those kinds of things that we will in the long run actually sort of prefer, the default option is not such a bad idea. It turns out that across the political spectrum, Americans like green electricity, electricity generated from renewables. Most of us actually don't have that latitude of sort of having that the default option. The kind of letters we get sort of every 3 months from our utility providers in the mail say, do you want to switch away from brown electricity and pay a little bit extra, like 10 cents more per kilowatt hour. But most of us actually throw that in the garbage. We don't even look at it. And those of us who look at it and try to actually switch to a green provider, it's not so easy, right? You have to get on a website. There are like 4 or 5 or 7 or 12 different providers. You have to make lots of decisions. It takes you like a good 20 minutes of your time, if you even get around to it. Well, in field experiments, both in Germany and the United States, when you sort of make that the opposite, the green electricity provider, or the optimal mix of green versus brown, because oftentimes 100% is not what utility providers can provide, but the optimal mix being the default option, people like that. If that's the default, then they have to basically switch, engage, and do the 20-minute transaction to get the brown electricity. Very few people do that. Most people actually get the green electricity because they don't even know any better, right? Because they threw the letter in the mail, in the garbage, just as they did before. But the second or third bill down the road, they realize they're paying more for the electricity. But then when they look at that, very few people switch away from that. Turns out most of us actually want green electricity. It makes zero sense not to make that the default option. The other thing to maybe sort of say is, the argument that you're manipulating people, or you're you're tricking people into doing something that they may not otherwise want, doesn't really hold so well, because there really is no. Bottom line is there's no value neutral way of presenting information. Like any way you present information, whether you don't give them a default, they have to choose between one or the other, or you make one the default option or the other one the default option. An attractive label and unattractive label. All of these decisions that you make all the time about how to present information have implications for what people will choose. There is no value neutral way of presenting information. And so what this kind of research shows, if nothing else, is that these contextual factors do play a role. And so therefore making us aware of these effects is so basically putting it on the table and disclosing what the effects will be. With sort of labels like buyer beware, use at your own risk. It can be used for good, it can be used for evil. I mean, advertising has known about this for a long time. The reason that we have attractive women next to cars that they want to sell is because that attracts our attention, and that option gets processed first, by query theory processes. But the bottom line is that these processes are there no matter what. And just because something has been the way we've been doing things and now we're changing it, doesn't make the change more manipulative than the initial way was, for whatever reasons. And sometimes it was just a cultural accident, like with organ donation. Germany and Austria have different policies, but sort of nobody quite knows why one is the other. Religious beliefs are very much similar in those countries. Sometimes there are good reasons. Sometimes there are companies who want us to do something that's to their advantage. Sometimes they're benevolent paternalists. We're trying to get us to eat better, or to reduce health expenses. But the bottom line, there's no neutral way of doing it. And so the takeaway is that we have to become aware that these things have an effect, and then to use them judiciously, either for ourselves or for others. So let me just sort of finish here.
So I wonder if there's analogous issues with respect to belief formation.
Say more.
So suppose I'm on a jury,
Mm-hmm.
and I was the foreman of the jury, and I get to ask, considering if I ask people to give me all the arguments for the guy having committed the defendant having committed the crime first, would make a difference to whether I asked him to give me all the reasons for thinking that the guy didn't commit the crime.
I'm sure it was. Here's one study that we've done in our lab that had to sort of, not quite the same, but certainly similar. One important decisions, or one important piece of information that you have to sort of know when you're deciding when to claim Social Security is how long you will live. To what age will you live? Obviously, because as you know, Social Security can start collecting at age 62. You have to start collecting at age 70. But for every year that you wait for collecting, you basically get more, sort of over the remainder of your life. Obviously, if you're going to keel over when you're 64, you want to start collecting at 62, right? That's the first opportunity. But if you're going to live till 90, or you just have this, you married a young wife, and you want to provide for her, you want to basically wait as long as possible, because you're going to get much more over your lifetime if you do that. And so how do people how good are people at sort of predicting how long they will live? Well, obviously you have to take into consideration your genetic makeup, when you're sort of in your family, when have people died, your exercise habits, your eating habits, your stress level. I mean, there are lots of objective factors that go into it. But it turns out it makes a difference. And when you ask people, why do you think about to which age will you live, or do you ask them by which age will you die? The age that you will live to, or the age that you will die by. Now again, from a rational perspective, it should make no difference, right? I mean, basically, it is exactly the same event. And it turns out that it makes a difference of something like 7 or 8 years in people's predictions.
So do they die later or stop living?
So they live to is longer than die by. Live to is longer. Now, why would that be? Well, think about it. Basically, so in this case, there's no choice, but there basically are value-enhancing arguments, life expectancy enhancing arguments, and life expectancy decreasing arguments.
Mm-hmm. Yeah? So how good are people at predicting that?
They're terrible at it. Yeah. But I mean, but there's a lot of random noise around. So what an actuarial model would predict. But turns out that live by is actually closer to the actuarial prediction than die by. But yeah, sort of the way query theory would apply to that is to say, okay, you think basically, what are you generating first? Life expectancy enhancing arguments or life expectancy decreasing arguments? Now, the label basically sort of favors one or the other. If you say live to, you first think about well, live to is life expectancy enhancing, right? Because we're talking about live to rather than die by. Die by generates life expectancy decreasing arguments first. You think about probably different relatives. Aunt Marjorie, who lived till 95, as opposed to Uncle Jack, who died when he was 55. And so they are sort of the frame of the question. Again, dictates a retrieval of different sorts of arguments, and as a result of that, sort of results in different beliefs. So I think you're right. I don't know. I guess maybe people are more pessimistic.
Does it have something to do with the loss versus gain?
I don't know. I don't have a good answer to that. And it's not a strong effect. I mean, they're pretty bad in both conditions. There's a lot of noise between individuals. It's just like the mean is a little closer.
Could improve their predictions about that quite a bit, probably, and bankrupt Social Security even sooner.
Yeah, right. Yeah. But it turns out that most people are basically collecting Social Security too early. If you just look, when do they actually die, and would they have been better if they had waited an extra year or 2 or 3? They would be. So there's a systematic error in when we claim, which probably has to do with the fact that most of us hate to work. Right? I mean, we're fortunate in our positions. Most of us actually like what we're doing in academia. But for most people, sort of working when you're 60, 65, you first think, when can I stop? When can I stop? You think of arguments for stopping, and claiming Social Security. And
they hate it, or it's very difficult.
Or it's hard on them. That's right. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So it's aversive in some way or the other. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So the examples are, we just heard Danny Kahneman gave us a talk not too long ago, and so most of your examples seem to have to do with thinking fast here.
Right.
Does this kind of analysis or to apply to thinking slow to problems where we think slowly, deliberating more?
So I think query theory is basically a process that applies to any kind of arguments that you generate. I mean, and the thinking fast versus thinking slow is really more like different classes of arguments, right? Thinking fast is sort of the emotional, visceral reactions that you might have to choice options, whereas thinking hard refers to sort of the more analytic, related to probability, related to values, related to sort of thinking about time delays, kind of arguments you might have for different choice options. But so regardless of what the content of the arguments is that you're generating, I mean, I would sort of venture to say that sort of query theory basically applies to either class. So to some extent, it's a little orthogonal to the thinking fast versus slow distinction.
I was trying to relate this to the. I once did a decision analysis for my parents-in-law, who were thinking about what retirement institution they should look at. And their problem was that they were going in circles, every option, somehow they couldn't keep track, of the arguments. Every time they thought about a choice, they would think about the reasons another place was better.
Uh-huh. Oh, I see. Yeah.
Or another choice was better. I guess maybe that's irrelevant.
Yeah, it might have helped you if you just sort of had assigned them to a choice option as a default option. So say, unless you find some arguments sort of not to move to home A, okay, you're going to move there. It's very related to the experiment, right?
So maybe this is not so relevant to your story.
Uh-huh.
The problem was that whenever they would settle on something,
Mm-hmm.
then they would remember.
What they were giving up.
Yes.
Yeah, that's right.
That's right.
Yeah, the regret. That's right.
That's right.
That's right.
Everything had some giving up to it.
Right.
So as soon as they settled on something, they would reject it.
Right. Yeah, I think that's like a different sort of mechanism.
It's neurotic.
That's neurotic. And that's the neuroticism of a couple, right? Because the problem is,
Well, they complemented each other about that. One of them settled on one thing and the other one put
well, as soon as one of them would settle on something, the other one would remember the reason not to do it.
As there wasn't one person doing it.
They probably had a good time doing this.
That's what happens when couples live together.
Yeah.